October 14, 2022, 2:17 a.m., Morris, Manitoba, a tiny community in the heart of the Canadian province where everyone knows each other by name, where life flows calmly and measuredly. Events that disrupt the usual order rarely happen here. In the evenings, the streets empty, the streetlights come on in even rows, and the whole town seems to sink into a deep, viscous sleep. But that night, something disturbed this familiar rhythm. A surveillance camera on the facade of house number 112 on Elm Street was triggered. A small lens pointed at the driveway between the houses recorded movement. A figure appears in the frame, a woman. Her silhouette is discernible in the dim streetlight, thin, average height, in a long hooded jacket. At first she moves uncertainly, as if listening to the sounds around her. But then her step becomes more determined. In her hands she carries a large plastic container. It noticeably sags under the weight, and the woman occasionally makes short stops to catch her breath. The recording is silent, but the frames convey how difficult this movement is for her. She approaches a car, an old sedan with a scuffed bumper, parked at the edge of the yard. The interior light comes on, meaning the door is open. The woman bends down, lifts the container from below, and with effort, slides it into the trunk. The movement is precise, as if rehearsed in advance. The trunk lid lowers, reflecting the streetlight for a second. She turns around. Her face is almost indistinguishable, but it's clear she is looking towards the house. A second, and her gaze disappears into the darkness. It seems she is checking if anyone is watching. The camera continues to record. Not a single window nearby is lit. No cars, no passers-by. Only a gentle wind rustles the leaves on the lawn. Everything looks too quiet, even suspiciously calm. After a few seconds, the brake lights come on. The car slowly turns around, leaves the yard, and the camera follows it to the very turn. Then, only a trail of light from the headlights and the streetlight reflected in puddles remain. That's all. The frame stops. 54 seconds of recording. No sound, no sudden movements. Later, investigators will review this video dozens of times. Each time, frame by frame, trying to catch something elusive, a gesture, a glance, a detail of clothing that could confirm the woman's identity. But the lens is old, of poor quality, and there are no clear contours. On the film, just a figure, just movement, no special distinguishing marks. Only the date and time at the bottom of the screen, 10/22 or 02/17. 24 minutes later, the same car will appear on another recording. A traffic camera at the city exit will capture it in the stream of rare night vans. The quality is poor, the image is fuzzy from the rain, but the shape of the taillights matches. After that, no traces. Not a single hit on city cameras, no mobile phone signal. As if the car dissolved into the darkness. The next morning, a statement will be filed at the Morris police station. A middle-aged man, agitated but restrained, will report that a member of his family has not returned home. He will say that this is unlike him, that he always returned on time, and will ask to check everything possible. The duty officer will record the statement in the log and send a group to the address, Elm Street, House 112. When the police arrive, the yard will look immaculate, swept clean, the car in place, the blinds drawn. The house is quiet inside, orderly, almost sterile. No signs of struggle, no mess. Only a strange detail. The surveillance cameras installed around the perimeter will be found cleared of recordings for the last 24 hours. All media, blank. Except for one copy, accidentally saved on a neighbor's cloud storage across the road. It is that copy that will show the woman with the container. This recording will be the starting point. The investigation, which will last for months, will begin with it. At first, everything looked like an ordinary disappearance, a routine case for a provincial town. But the more investigators learned, the more obvious it became. This was not an accidental disappearance, but a carefully prepared act. For the residents of Morris, this will be a shock. People will start discussing what happened in stores, at gas stations, at the entrance to the church. Everyone will say the same thing. They were an ideal family. And the investigators, reviewing the frames of the night recording, will return to one moment, the woman bending over the trunk. Because it was this frame, 2:17 a.m., that became the first thread that would then pull the entire chain of events. the point from which the story began, which changed all perceptions of quiet life in the small Canadian town. Elm Street in Morris is a typical suburban landscape where every house resembles its neighbor. Wooden facades, even fences, identical mailboxes. Here, life flows according to an established rhythm. In the mornings, people walk their dogs. During the day, lawnmowers hum. And in the evenings, television lights softly flicker in the windows. It's a place where everything is predictable, where silence is perceived as the norm, not as an alarm signal. It was here that house number 112 stood, neat with gray siding and white shutters. The Aldridge family home, a family everyone knew. David Aldridge, 42 years old, worked for a local telecommunications company, an ordinary technical position, without ambition but stable. He was not a person who attracted attention, reserved, taciturn, but friendly. Every morning, he was seen driving his gray pickup truck. Exactly at 7:30 a.m., he would leave the yard and return around 6 p.m. On weekends, he would fix something in the garage, sometimes tinker with the car, sometimes just stand at the gate, watching his son play on the lawn. Caroline, his wife, 38 years old, was his complete opposite. Always well-groomed, friendly, active. She often appeared in town, at the library, at school events, at church gatherings. She organized charity events, collected clothes for the needy, participated in fairs. She was described as a woman who has everything under control, always polite, always with a smile. For most Morris residents, Caroline was a symbol of reliability, someone you could turn to for help. She didn't just act friendly, she built a reputation around herself, and she built it confidently. The family moved to Morris in 2015. Many remembered this. Back then, after the tragedy when David's first wife died, he sold his house in Winnipeg and moved here with his son. They said he wanted a fresh start. Here, on the outskirts, life really seemed calmer. A year later, he met Caroline, a teacher from a neighboring district, and they soon married. After the wedding, the house transformed. New curtains appeared on the windows, flowers in the yard. The lawn was perfectly mowed, and a welcome sign hung on the porch. Neighbors joked, "If there's an ideal house in Morris, it's theirs." David's son, Ethan, was a reserved boy, but Caroline always accompanied him. She took him to school, to clubs, helped with homework. Sometimes neighbors saw them riding bikes together on the street or planting plants by the house. No one ever heard loud conversations or arguments, not a single cause for concern. And if police reports are to be believed, the Aldridge family truly never appeared in any databases. No calls, no appeals, no signals. Complete silence. When investigators began interviewing neighbors, their answers were almost verbatim. They are good people, quiet, polite. Caroline always greeted you, would stop and ask how you were, recalled a neighbor from across the street. She helped the school, always brought something to charity fairs. Everyone respected her, said the local school principal. "I don't think they are capable of anything bad. It's Caroline after all," another neighbor added. It was precisely this that caused internal tension among the investigators. Everything was too smooth, too perfect. The camera recording showing a woman driving away with a heavy container at night did not fit this image at all. The smiling volunteer, the ideal mother and wife, and the figure in a hood, moving in the dark with strained, heavy movements. Detectives checked everything: the family's financial records, medical charts, correspondence, even participation in public projects. The result was the same, nothing suspicious. It seemed they were looking at an example of what a happy family should look like. But the more they examined the details, the stronger the feeling became that this was a facade, too even, too flawless, as if someone had spent years creating an image to hide something else behind it. In Morris, such people were respected. And that's why the news that house number 112 was now under investigation shocked everyone. People didn't believe it was possible. But the investigation had only just begun, and with each new interrogation, with each new piece of evidence, thin cracks appeared in this story, barely noticeable, but increasingly dangerous. The facade, which for many years had seemed unshakable, began to gradually crumble, and very soon, what the Aldridge family had been hiding from everyone would be revealed. October 13, 2022, 9 p.m. An ordinary evening in Morris. The autumn chill had already settled on the streets and a light fog trailed over the rooftops. Most residents were preparing for bed, and only rare lights glowed in the windows. At that moment, a call came into the emergency services. A man's voice sounded agitated, but restrained. It was David Aldridge. He reported that he could not find his son. According to him, the boy had gone out during the day to play at friends' houses and had not returned home. The operator clarified the details, what time he left, where exactly he might be, with whom he was communicating. David answered briefly, sometimes incoherently. At first, he said he only noticed his absence in the evening, when it started to get dark. Then he added that he waited for his son to return on his own. His voice was tense but without panic, the tone of a person trying to convince himself that everything is under control. When the duty officer asked if the boy had a phone or a way to contact him, the answer came immediately. No, he's usually nearby, he doesn't need one. This phrase changed everything. Without a phone, impossible to track. Without communication, unknown where he is now. From this moment, the case shifted from a domestic matter to a potentially dangerous one. 20 minutes later, the first patrol car arrived at the Aldridge home. Officers entered, a calm, well-kept house, everything in its place. Caroline, David's wife, was in the kitchen. She looked composed, but tension was visible in her eyes. When asked when she last saw Ethan, she replied that it was around 4 p.m. He was going to visit a neighbor's boy and promised to be back for dinner. When he didn't return, she thought he might have been delayed. Neighbors confirmed Ethan had indeed left the house during the day. Several people saw him on the street corner, but then the trail was lost. Not all cameras in the area were working. Some private systems were disconnected. The police immediately requested recordings, but at that time found nothing suspicious. Everything looked like an ordinary evening stroll that, for some reason, ended in disappearance. Investigators began to process the statement. In the appearance description section, standard data, height, clothing, distinguishing marks. No items stood out, nothing that could immediately direct the search in a specific direction. The house was checked. No signs of voluntary departure, belongings in place, clothes neatly folded, a school backpack on the table. Everything looked as if the owner of the room had simply stepped out for a minute. Yet intuition suggested that this was not just a missing person case. According to protocol, the room was sealed. Yellow tape, a do not enter sign, a report on the seizure of items. This was the moment when the search case first turned into an investigation. On paper, it looked formal, but for everyone standing in the hallway of house number 112 at that moment, it was clear. Now something far more serious was at stake. David behaved reservedly. He answered questions calmly, in short phrases, avoiding unnecessary details. He said that perhaps it's all a misunderstanding, and Ethan would return on his own. Police noted that he didn't show panic, but looked tired, as if internally burned out. Caroline, on the other hand, tried to take action. She offered to call classmates, check with parents of friends, even went out into the yard, checked the gate and garden. Outwardly, a caring mother acting on instinct. When the statement was completed, the duty officer announced, "Missing person registered. We are beginning the search." The case was assigned number 77B451. From this moment, it became an official investigation. That same night, police checked the nearest streets. Several cars drove through the area, inspecting vacant lots, the playground, the riverbank. Not a single clue. K9 dogs arrived in the morning, but could not pick up a scent. Likely the trail was already lost due to weather conditions. By then, the town already knew about the disappearance. The first posts asking for help appeared on social media. People wrote that they had seen patrol cars on Elm Street, that police had visited the Aldridge home. News travels fast in Morris, and within a few hours, everyone knew Ethan's name. The next morning, volunteers joined the case. A headquarters was set up. Search zones were defined. The map of the area was divided into squares, each of which was checked in turn. By that time, the investigation was still considering the version of a simple disappearance. No one even suspected that at the same time, a few hours later, a camera on a neighboring house would record movement. A woman driving away with a large plastic container at night. Case 77B451 officially began as a standard missing person investigation, but within 24 hours, its materials would become part of an entirely different story. a story in which the disappearance would be only the first step in a chain of events leading to the unraveling of a secret hidden behind the doors of house number 112. When the investigation first began, everything proceeded according to standard procedure. Investigators worked methodically, without assumptions, simply recording each step. The Aldridge home became the starting point. Within the first few hours, police formulated a plan, inspecting the premises, interviewing the parents, collecting data from surveillance cameras, requesting information from the school and neighbors. All of this seemed like a routine, customary process. No one then imagined that one of these actions would soon turn the entire investigation on its head. First, the investigative team inspected the house. In the kitchen, order, clean dishes, neatly stacked newspapers on the table. In the living room, even pillows, a television stood in the corner, turned off since the evening. Ethan's room, as if frozen. Open notebooks remained on the desk, a half-built construction toy figure on the windowsill, as if someone was about to finish and got distracted. Everything looked as if the room's owner had just stepped out for a minute, and yet, intuition suggested that this was not just a case of disappearance. According to protocol, the room was sealed. Yellow tape, a "do not enter" sign, a report on the seizure of items. This was the moment when the search case first transformed into an investigation. On paper, it looked formal, but for everyone standing in the hallway of house number 112 at that moment, it was obvious. Now, something far more serious was at stake. The parents were interviewed the same day. David and Caroline sat side by side. He spoke calmly, in short phrases, avoiding unnecessary details. She, on the contrary, was talkative, tried to help the investigation, recalled everything she could. According to her, in the evening they sat at home, watched television, then went to bed. Neither of them heard any sounds, noticed anything unusual. "We just waited, thought he would come back soon," Caroline said. At first glance, everything seemed logical, but Detective Stevens, who led the group, had a feeling from the very beginning that something in this story didn't add up. Too precise answers, too calm a tone. In his experience, there had been cases where outwardly ideal families hid strange details. And he understood. If there was indeed a lie behind the outward calm, it had to be sought in the small things, those not controlled by words. That same day, he sent a request to collect all surveillance camera recordings within a kilometer radius. In Morris, many people installed cameras, on garages, on house facades, even near mailboxes. Most often, they were used simply to monitor the property. Investigators began reviewing the recordings from nearby houses. The first few hours, nothing. People, cars, evening strolls, lights in windows. Ordinary life. When they reached the recording from house number 110, a camera installed on the corner of the garage, the time on the timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. On the screen, the familiar silhouette of Elm Street, and in the frame, the Aldridge home. Stevens sped up the recording, then paused it again. From the darkness, headlights appear. A car slowly drives out of the yard. Nothing happens for a few seconds, then the headlights turn onto the street. The recording quality was poor, an old model camera, but the shape of the car body and the silhouette of the woman getting behind the wheel were clearly distinguishable. Stevens rewound and enlarged the frame. The license plate was illegible, but the car model matched Caroline Aldridge's car, a white Subaru Outback. The next detail left no doubt. A large plastic container, which the woman carefully loaded into the trunk. Not rushing, not nervous. The movements were confident, precise. After that, the trunk closed, and the car slowly drove away. For the investigator, this was the moment when the theory of a simple disappearance ceased to exist. What they saw did not fit the family's story. No, waited all night at home. Everything looked different. And it was this video that first captured the inconsistency from which the entire subsequent chain would begin. When Stevens printed out the freeze frames and added them to case 77 B451, he understood. Officially, this was still just an unexplained action. But in his experience, there had not been a single case where a person who reported a disappearance left home in the middle of the night without notifying the police. The next day, he called David and Caroline for a second interrogation, formally, to clarify their sleeping hours and evening activities. But in reality, this was the first step toward uncovering the lie. The video from the garage camera became that first piece of evidence that tore apart the facade of the ideal family. From that moment on, the investigation no longer viewed house number 112 as a waiting place. It became the starting point of a mystery that was only beginning to unfold. When Caroline was called for a second interrogation, she came in the same gray trench coat in which she had been seen on the day the statement was filed. Confident stride, neat hairstyle, no signs of anxiety. She looked composed, as if she had simply come to clarify a couple of details. But the investigators already knew, behind this outward calmness lay a lie. Detective Stevens led the interrogation. The room was small, windowless, with a standard table, a dictaphone, and a protocol. At first, everything proceeded calmly, clarifying the time, evening activities, details of the conversation with her husband. Everything repeated her initial testimony, until Stevens asked a direct question. "Caroline, did you leave the house the night Ethan disappeared?" She did not look away. She was silent for several seconds, then answered briefly, "No, we were home." The answer was even, without a pause, without an attempt to justify herself. According to the protocol, everything looked clear, but Stevens already knew that, at this moment, she was lying. On his table lay a USB flash drive, a video recording from the camera that captured the car, leaving house number 112 at 2:17 a.m. He didn't show the recording immediately. He simply continued the conversation, giving her the opportunity to clarify details. "What time did you go to bed?" "Around 11. We were very tired." "And neither of you got up until morning?" "No, we slept." He nodded, made a note in the protocol, and inserted the flash drive into the laptop. The screen was turned towards her. Seconds of silence. On the video, the familiar facade of their house. Then headlights, movement, a figure by the car. Caroline initially froze, then shifted her chin, as if not immediately understanding what she was seeing. "Is that you?" Stevens asked calmly. The pause stretched. She looked at the screen, but did not answer. Then she shifted her gaze to the investigator. "Yes, it's me, but it's not what you think." Her voice softened, as if she was asking for understanding in advance. A second, and a new version was ready. "I was taking out old trash. We had plastic containers in the garage. I'd been meaning to throw them away for a long time. I just didn't want to wake my husband, so I decided to do it at night." The explanation sounded ordinary, even plausible. Almost, but it was precisely in such details that lies hide. Stevens knew that if a person is lying, they try to make their story as mundane as possible, so that it doesn't raise unnecessary questions. He wrote her words into the protocol, without comment. After the interrogation, the officer called the city dump. It was a simple check, a routine formality. The dispatcher answered on the other end. Stevens asked if a white Subaru Outback could have been recorded entering on the night of October 13. The answer came immediately. "No, the dump closes at 6 p.m. Cameras are off. There's no security at night." This was the tipping point. Caroline's story collapsed in an instant. Her story about trash turned out to be physically impossible. Therefore, she was lying. And not just hiding a small detail, she was deliberately misleading the investigation. After the check, investigators returned to the reports. On the video, the same plastic container, clean, sturdy, large. And if she was driving it away in the middle of the night without notifying anyone, and if the dump was officially closed, then this trip had another purpose. That same day, Stevens issued an order for temporary surveillance of the Aldridge home. Now the family, known in Morris as exemplary, officially became the subject of an internal investigation. From this moment, Caroline Aldridge ceased to be a witness. She became the main suspect, and the investigation only had to find out where exactly she went that night and what she took in that container. When the search warrant took effect, the town of Morris seemed to freeze. Such things didn't happen here. The Aldridge home, always well-maintained and quiet, now stood surrounded by police cars. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, not daring to come closer. Everything looked official, but it felt like the beginning of something much bigger. Caroline did not resist. She allowed them to enter, did not argue, did not ask questions. Outwardly, calm, inwardly, cold detachment. Investigators moved quickly, addressing each item on the warrant. First, the car. The white Subaru Outback, parked at the house, looked perfectly clean. The body gleamed as if after a wash, the wheels wiped to a shine. But it was this sterility that was alarming. too perfect for a family where a disappearance had recently occurred. Officers photographed the car from all sides, then opened the trunk. Inside, exactly what everyone expected. The same container, a gray plastic box with a tight lid, neatly placed by the back seat. It looked like ordinary household storage, but its presence filled the air with palpable tension. Criminalists opened it, and inside was nothing. Absolutely empty. There wasn't even a speck of dust. Investigators checked the surface, scanned the walls, bottom, handles. No dirt, no stains, not even stray fibers. The plastic looked new, but those who had worked with evidence for years immediately understood. This was not an accident. Such a result only occurs when someone specifically cleans the surface. They checked the entire car, the floor mats, fresh, spotless, smelling of light lemon from cleaning solution. The glove compartment empty. Even the trunk compartment was clean to a shine. At first glance, impeccable cleanliness. In reality, a sterile emptiness that spoke louder than any evidence. When Caroline was asked why the car looked as if it had just been detailed, she replied curtly, "I clean often." The search continued in the house. The kitchen gleamed. There wasn't even a trace of grease on the stove. The bathroom smelled of bleach, and on the laundry shelves stood several bottles of bleach and disinfectants. Ethan's room, neat as if for display. Nothing superfluous, not a single speck of dust. Even the window was washed to transparency. Criminalists applied luminol, a reagent that reveals traces of biological fluids under ultraviolet light. The lights were turned off. Several seconds, silence, and the faint flicker of instrument screens. But nothing. Not a single glow. The luminol remained silent. Neither in the trunk, nor on the floor, nor on the container walls. This seemed almost unbelievable, as if nothing living had ever happened here. Despair was felt within the group, but professionalism did not allow them to stop. Then they decided to go deeper, to check the composition of the surfaces. Swabs were sent to the lab. 24 hours later, a report came back. A high concentration of chlorine-containing substances. Essentially, all the plastic and metal of the car were saturated with disinfectant residue. Chemists noted that this could only be achieved with repeated treatment with concentrate. This became the first serious signal. Not just she cleaned, she was destroying evidence. This wasn't accidental washing. This was a deliberate cleanup. When the results were correlated with the time frame and the video recording, everything fell into place. Night, container removal, return, and sterility. Based on laboratory report number C198, Detective Stevens compiled an internal memo. It stated, traces of chlorine-containing reagents have been found on the surfaces of the container and luggage compartment elements. The concentration indicates deliberate actions aimed at destroying possible biological evidence. This document became a turning point. Until this moment, the investigation had operated only on circumstantial suspicions, lies, contradictions, strange behavior. But now, the first direct fact emerged in the case. Someone was deliberately erasing the past. Following the report's publication, Caroline's status officially changed. She was no longer considered a witness in the case. Now, she was listed as the main suspect. Her home was no longer just the Aldridge family's residence. It became a stage where, apparently, the illusion of a normal life was meticulously played out. The investigation understood. If everything here was cleaned so thoroughly, it meant there was a place somewhere that this cleanliness hadn't reached. And that was where they had to go next. When the Aldridge case went beyond a simple missing person investigation, Caroline's behavior became the subject of close scrutiny. In the days when searches were underway in Morris, when volunteers scoured fields and forest plantations, when posters with Ethan's photograph were put up all over town, she remained at home. No public statements, no interviews, no attempts to join the search. She simply secluded herself in her yard and, according to neighbors, spent hours in the garden, quietly, calmly, with pruning shears in hand, as if trying to hold on to the familiar. To the police, it seemed strange. To the townspeople, it was frightening. Everyone around participated in the search, brought water, cooked food for volunteers, organized collections. But Caroline, the mother of the missing boy, seemed to live a parallel life. A neighbor from the house across the street later said in an interview, "She looked as if nothing had happened." just trimming bushes, sometimes sitting on the porch with a cup of tea. This calmness irritated even those who had previously admired her composure. The investigation initiated surveillance. A camera installed across from the house recorded her daily life. No breakdowns, no hysterics, no meetings, no attempts to talk to the press. Only measured movements around the yard, household chores, and occasionally, calls she made sitting in her car without entering the house. In the evening, curtains tightly drawn, lights off. It created the impression that no one lived inside the house. On the third day after surveillance began, she drove to town. A normal trip, but the officer conducting the surveillance noted a strangeness. She visited the bank. There, according to official data, she withdrew $5,000 in cash. Not a huge sum, but for a woman who had previously conducted online transactions, it seemed unusual. Neither in the foundation's affairs, where she had previously volunteered, nor in family expenses were such cash transactions recorded. Where this money went could not be established. Not a single receipt, not a single movement of funds was recorded after that. The money simply disappeared, just as Ethan had disappeared. The temporary panic theory didn't work. Panic doesn't last for weeks, especially when a person exhibits such outward coldness. Her husband, David, actively participated in the search during these days. He gave interviews, thanked volunteers, and asked people not to judge his wife. On camera, he said she was holding up as best she could, that it was difficult for her, and that everyone reacts differently. But people saw something else. They saw a woman who had shut herself off, and a man who was trying to protect not so much her, as the familiar image of a normal life crumbling before his eyes. As the investigation deepened, the distance between the spouses grew. They barely spoke. Joint footsteps were no longer heard in their house. She did not appear at the search sites and did not answer the investigators' calls. The only recorded outgoing call that aroused the interest of the operatives was made to the law firm Brooks and Partners. The call took place in the evening, several hours after the results of the car examination became known to the investigation. Her voice, recorded on the answering machine, was calm, almost devoid of intonation. She asked for a callback, mentioning that consultation is needed on a case related to wrongful accusation. This became the final element that ultimately formed the suspect's psychological profile for the investigation. She did not search, did not cry, did not address the public. She was preparing for her defense. When a person takes such steps, it is no longer the reaction of a frightened mother. It is the behavior of a person who knows that an interrogation, an accusation, and possibly a trial will follow. From this moment, the investigation ceased to be a missing person story. It turned into an unraveling of a carefully hidden secret where every detail, every trifle, even a bank statement, could become a thread leading to the solution of what happened that night. After the searches, when the Aldridge house seemed to be an exhausted source of evidence, the investigation made another move: digital forensics. Everything that could store data was seized: phones, flash drives, a tablet, even smartwatches. But Caroline's laptop attracted special attention, the very one from which she worked, maintaining records for the charity fund and correspondence with Morris residents. It stood on the table in the living room, neatly closed, as if just waiting to be opened again. When the digital forensic specialists received the device, they immediately noticed. The last actions on the laptop were recorded on October 12, that is, the day before the 911 call. And this was already strange. But what turned out to be even more interesting was that the browser history had been cleared, not just partially, but completely. Even autofill fields deleted. This didn't look like an accidental click, but a deliberate erasure of traces. The same was done with the trash and temporary files. Technical analysis showed that the cleaning was done manually, not by a program. Someone knew exactly how to delete traces so that the system would not save an activity log. But specialists also knew how to recover what was lost. The seized hard drive was copied in laboratory conditions, and the slow process of recovering deleted data began. This took almost 2 days. When the first results appeared, it became clear Caroline's efforts were in vain. The system recorded temporary tags of cached pages, and from them, the history of search queries for several days before Ethan's disappearance was restored. October 10. Query: sodium hydroxide effect on tissues. October 11. soil freezing depth in Manitoba. October 12, organic decomposition temperature. These phrases in themselves looked like something scientific, as if a person was preparing a report or studying chemistry. But to the investigators, they sounded different, especially in the context of what was happening in the Aldrich house. Further, even worse, the recovered data showed transitions to forums and pages where methods for destroying biological traces from surfaces were discussed. Several links led to resources on construction and geology, including the query, deserted places and abandoned quarries near Morris. This could no longer be explained by accidental curiosity. When Detective Stevens received the report from the laboratory, he didn't immediately believe what he saw. He reread every line, then cross-referenced the dates with other events. Everything matched. The search queries appeared 2 to 3 days before Ethan's disappearance, and the last one was made on the evening of October 12, several hours before the camera recorded Caroline with the container. This sequence ruled out randomness. No one searches for information about the depth of soil freezing at night for no reason. No one deletes their entire browser history if it doesn't contain something that could incriminate them. Digital forensics turned assumption into proof. Now the investigation had not only physical confirmation of the cleanup, but also documented searches that spoke for themselves. When the results were officially added to case file D-452, there was no longer any doubt within the department. Everything pointed to intentionality. Caroline did not act in a panic, did not make mistakes. She planned, cold-bloodedly, in advance, with calculation. After the report's publication, Stevens said in an interview, "Sometimes a criminal leaves a trace at the scene, and sometimes they leave it in the device's memory, and that trace speaks more than any words." From this moment on, the Aldrich case ceased to be just a missing person investigation. It became a study of intent, of what is born long before a crime, and it was to this stage that the investigation was now moving. After the recovery of the search history, the investigation decided to obtain expert opinions. To eliminate any interpretations, specialists were brought in, an independent chemist, a soil scientist, and a profiler from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Their task was simple: to translate dry technical terms into understandable words and assess their significance in the context of the investigation. When the experts reviewed the materials, the chemist was the first to speak. He immediately drew attention to the query, sodium hydroxide effect on tissues. According to him, this substance is one of the most aggressive alkalis, dissolving organic matter. In everyday life, it is used to clean pipes, but in a laboratory environment or in forensics, it is a tool for destroying biological material. He noted that an ordinary person rarely shows interest in the chemical effect of such a compound on tissues, unless in the context of an experiment or intentional destruction. This explanation sounded restrained, but in itself carried a heavy undertone. Next, the soil science expert chimed in. His attention was drawn to the search queries about the depth of soil freezing in Manitoba. He explained that such data is typically used in construction, for example, when laying foundations. However, combined with other queries involving the temperature of organic decomposition, the picture looked entirely different. This interest, in his opinion, indicated not household purposes, but the study of natural conditions for long-term concealment of traces. He emphasized that the mention of a specific region made this interest non-random. The person wanted to understand how capable the soil was of concealing traces for an extended period. When it was the profiler's turn, the conversation took on a different character. He was not interested in the content of the queries. He analyzed behavior. According to him, the decisive factor was not the information itself, but its sequence and timing. The first query was made 2 days before Ethan's disappearance. The second, the next day the third, several hours before the night when the camera recorded Caroline with the container. This time interval, according to the profiler, speaks of systematic planning. The person did not act in a fit of passion, did not seek impulsive solutions. They studied, compared, checked, as if preparing for specific actions. Further, the profiler noted another detail. All queries were made in incognito mode. This indicated an intention to conceal the very act of searching. This is not done out of curiosity, but out of calculation. He called it typical behavior of an individual who realizes that their actions can be interpreted as criminal, and therefore acts in the shadows from the outset. Collectively, the three opinions formed a clear picture. The chemist provided a scientific explanation for the substance, the soil scientist showed the logic in choosing the location, and the profiler established the temporal and behavioral structure. Everything converged into one line: preparation, plan, execution. The official report, signed by the senior investigator and added to the case under number D462, stated, "Search activity indicates methodical preparation for concealing traces of a crime. The sequence of queries and timestamps confirm that Caroline Aldridge's actions were deliberate and pre-planned, beginning no less than 24 hours before the missing person report was filed." This wording marked a turning point. After this, the investigation stopped viewing Caroline as someone confused by emotions or frightened by the consequences. From this moment on, she was regarded as a person who acted coldly and with calculation. Now, the task was different. It was not just about proving that she was hiding something, but understanding. Where were the traces of what she was trying to destroy? The investigation went beyond the house, the car, and digital evidence. Ahead lay the search for the very place that, judging by her queries, she had sought out in advance. When the investigation reached a point where the picture seemed almost complete, investigators decided to check if there was anything they were missing. Any serious investigation requires that the primary theory withstand scrutiny from alternatives. Thus began a review of the original data: interviews, electronic trails, Ethan's surroundings. Everything that could be rechecked was rechecked. Classmates were re-interviewed. These conversations at first glance promised nothing new. Everyone had already said that Ethan was calm, sociable, and non-confrontational, but one of the boys suddenly mentioned a detail that made investigators wary. According to him, Ethan had often spoken in recent weeks about some friend from the internet. Not an acquaintance, not a relative, but specifically someone he communicated with online, but never showed anyone the correspondence. He simply called him Ranger. This phrase immediately changed the direction of the search. The investigation requested a full report on his tablet, which was found in the house and was already undergoing examination. The device was unlocked using a backup account, and indeed, in one of the game chats, a conversation with a user named Ranger7 was found. The dialogues were fragmented, typical for online communication. Short phrases, discussions about games, a few messages without an obvious connection. But one of them stood out. "We can meet if you want. I'll be near the field behind the school on Friday night." Friday. That was the night of October 13. The message looked like a possible lead. Investigators took it seriously. If a meeting was indeed supposed to take place, then perhaps someone from outside was involved in the disappearance. This theory could turn the case around and remove suspicion from Caroline. Therefore, the RCMP sent a request to the provider to track the IP address of user Ranger7. While awaiting a response, surveillance cameras around the school and nearby streets were checked. No suspicious vehicles or individuals matching the approximate time of the supposed meeting were found in the recordings. But the investigation did not stop. The trace still yielded a result. The IP address led to a neighboring town, approximately 40 kilometers from Morris. That day, a group of operatives went there. They found the house to which the address belonged and knocked on the door. A boy about 12 years old opened it, frightened but not resistant. His parents were in the house. Surprised by the police visit, they immediately allowed them to inspect the equipment. The child's laptop indeed had a Ranger7 account, and the very same correspondence was preserved in the browser history. Soon, everything became clear. The boy confessed that he had met Ethan in a game several weeks ago. They chatted about trivial things, strategies, characters, levels. The idea of meeting belonged to him, but according to him, he got scared when he realized it was about a real meeting, and that evening, he never showed up. He didn't even report it. He just turned off his phone and didn't log back into the chat. The check confirmed his words. By activity time, geolocation, and account matching, there was no doubt. The secret friend theory collapsed as quickly as it appeared. For the investigation, this meant one thing. No external perpetrator was involved in the story. No kidnapping, no conspiracy. Everything returned to the Aldridge house and to the woman who had behaved from the very beginning, as if she knew more than she was saying. When the case was closed along this line, Detective Stevens noted in his report, "The online contact theory is excluded. Ethan's actions show no signs of preparing to run away. His connection with user Ranger7 is deemed accidental. This dead end, it seemed, yielded nothing, but its significance was the opposite. Every false lead, every refuted direction, only strengthened the main theory. The deeper all other options were checked, the more obvious it became. All roads once again led to the same person, Caroline Aldridge. The investigation returned to the original line, but now without doubts and without backup theories. All that remained was to find evidence of what had happened to Ethan. When the investigation was convinced that there were no more external suspects, attention returned to her. And then, for the first time, investigators decided to look at Caroline not as the stepmother of the missing boy, but as a person with her own biography, past, and possibly moments she would prefer to keep silent about. At first glance, her story looked impeccable. A woman with a university education, she taught art, participated in charity programs, and moved from Winnipeg to Morris with her husband, where they opened a fund to help those in need. But the deeper the investigators dug, the more cracks appeared in this ideal picture. An official request was sent to the archives of Winnipeg Social Services. It was expected that there would be nothing unusual there. At most, records of charitable initiatives. However, the response from the department came with an attachment of 2 documents marked confidential. These were appeals received by Child Protective Services in 2018 and 2020. Anonymous calls, both from the same address where Caroline lived at the time. The first message was recorded late in the evening, March 11, 2018. A woman on the line reported that loud female screams and prolonged crying were coming from the neighboring apartment. The second arrived 2 years later, in January 2020. Then the caller spoke of regular nightly quarrels and screams resembling pleas for help. In both cases, service employees responded to the scene, but after checking, the cases were closed. The wording was the same. No signs of threat to life or physical harm found. For the police, these records became an important detail. Not proof, but background. They showed that something had already happened behind the facade of a quiet, composed woman. Emotional outbursts, scandals, perhaps internal tension that did not manifest publicly but existed. After this, the investigation decided to check other aspects of her life. An RCMP financial analyst was brought into the case. He was tasked with tracing Caroline's payment history before her marriage to David Aldridge. The results were unexpected. A year before her marriage, she had several outstanding loans, a total exceeding $40,000. Some debts were related to an unsuccessful attempt to open an art studio, others to personal loans. After the marriage, all debts were paid off. Payments were made from David Aldridge's business account. The financial expert's report contained a laconic but concise line. Material dependence established. Level of control over the family budget, minimal. And this phrase explained a lot. Now, the investigation saw not just a woman who was confused, but a person who already had experience with pressure, loss of control, and debt dependence. For Caroline, her new marriage was not just a new life, but an opportunity to erase the old one. Anything that reminded her of past failures, debts, scandals, dependence, caused her irritation and fear. And if someone in this new life prevented her from maintaining an ideal picture, she likely saw it as a threat. The collected archival data did not provide direct evidence of guilt, but it changed the perception of Caroline's character. Now, her image was no longer that of a random heroine of a tragedy. The investigation was faced with a person with stable patterns, secrecy, control, and an internal conflict between outward well-being and inner chaos. When these materials were added to the file, the Aldridge case ceased to be merely a crime investigation. It became a portrait, a story about how meticulously one can build an ideal life, until one mistake exposes everything that was hidden for years beneath the surface. The investigation decided to move forward, to check the last link in this chain, the financial fund that Caroline managed. There, according to investigators, the real answers might lie. Caroline Aldridge sat across from the investigators again, a small interrogation room, even lamplight, a silence in which the air conditioner could be heard. Everything looked as it should in the final moments before an official accusation. On the table, a folder with evidence, printed photographs, a tablet, a flash drive with a copy of her search history, call logs. Her lawyer, a stern man in glasses, sat beside her, barely looking at her. He knew that today she might say too much, and every word would be recorded. The interrogation began without introduction. Detective William Stevens opened the folder, looked at her, and spoke evenly, without pressure, but with the firmness of a man who was no longer searching. Caroline, today we want you to help us understand why you deleted your browser history on the night of October 13 to 14. She shrugged almost imperceptibly. It wasn't me. Ethan used the computer. I didn't even know he deleted anything. Stevens nodded. A printout with timestamps and account logins was placed on the table. The deletion session began at 2:41 a.m. At that time, according to your husband's testimony, you were alone in the house. Ethan was already asleep. Caroline looked away. Her lips trembled slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. Perhaps it was automatic. The computer sometimes cleaned its history itself. The detective didn't respond. He simply turned the page and showed a list of search queries. Chemical substances, soil temperatures, deserted places near Morris. Explain why you needed this. She paused and then said quietly, It was a school project. I was helping Ethan with a science paper. We were studying soil composition. Stevens looked at her in silence. Then he took another sheet from the folder. We contacted his teacher. There was no such project. A silence fell. She looked away, as if trying to focus on anything but his eyes. Her lawyer lightly touched her hand under the table, reminding her not to say too much, but she still tried. Perhaps he did it himself. I didn't know. Stevens closed the printout. He moved on to the next topic, calls to social services. In 2018 and 2020, anonymous calls were recorded from your previous address. Can you explain what was happening then? That's a lie, she replied, now with a hint of irritation. David and I never fought. The neighbors probably decided to complain out of envy. They always interfered. The detective made no comment. He simply made a note in his notepad and moved on. When the conversation turned to her debts before marriage, Caroline remained silent. Only once did she look up and say curtly, This is irrelevant to the case. But Stevens saw how her posture changed, how she clasped her hands on her lap. Everything that could destabilize her did. By the end of the 5th hour of interrogation, her voice had grown hoarse. Each new piece of evidence sounded like a step down a staircase, leading to a point where denial no longer saved her. The lawyer did not interfere. He simply watched as she lost her composure. When Stevens finally put down the documents and said, Caroline, where is Ethan now? She looked at him expressionless. This question was not unexpected. She knew it would come. She knew, and, it seemed, had already decided what she would do. Her lawyer quietly said, We will not answer any more questions. After that, she lowered her eyes and said not a word. A heavy, expectant silence hung in the room. The detective understood that this was it. There would be no confession. As she left, the camera light remained on. Her footsteps sounded muffled, as if walking on water. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. On the table lay a thin stack of papers, evidence, a protocol, a list of facts, each pointing to her. The investigation now had everything: motive, preparation, lies, traces of cleanup, digital evidence. There was only one thing missing, that which concludes any such story. But this did not stop the investigation. On the contrary, the absence of a confession became a catalyst. Now all the investigation's attention focused on finding confirmation of what she so stubbornly refused to say aloud. When it seemed that the investigation had exhausted every possible lead in the case, the RCMP laboratory decided to make one more attempt. Formally, just a clarification in the report, an additional check on an already closed item. But it is precisely such decisions that often become turning points. A re-examination was ordered for the very plastic container seized from the trunk of Caroline's car. The first analysis yielded nothing. The container was perfectly clean, no trace of blood, no fibers, no biological particles. At the time, it seemed she had indeed foreseen everything. But in the intervening months, the laboratory had acquired new reagents, substances capable of detecting traces that standard methods could not. One of the forensic scientists, a microtrace specialist, insisted they had to try. Even if the chance was minuscule, the container was delivered to a sterile room. This time, the examination was decided to be conducted not only on the inner walls, as before, but in detail under a microscope, checking every joint, every protrusion. The expert paid particular attention to the lid. the very one with a tight silicone seal that created airtightness. Under ultraviolet light, a barely discernible tint was noticed on the edge, faint but unusual. Upon removing the seal, the expert found a tiny fiber underneath it. Ultra-thin, blue, almost invisible to the eye. It was stuck between the plastic and the rubber, apparently when the lid was closed. At first, it was not given much importance. Such microparticles can come from anywhere. But the habit of checking everything played its role. The fiber was sent for analysis. Under the microscope, it showed the structure of synthetic fabric with cotton particles. The first thing that came to the forensic experts' minds was pajamas or loungewear. Then the experts compared the found sample with fibers from Ethan's room, where his belongings had been previously seized. A spectral analysis was conducted in the laboratory. The result matched in structure and dye shade. It was the same fiber. After this, the next step began. Molecular. Microparticles of skin were successfully extracted from the fiber. They were sent for DNA analysis. The procedure took several days. The report arrived on January 19 at 10:47 a.m. The laconic wording, signed by 3 experts, stated, "The fiber found under the container's seal is identical to the material of the pajamas seized from Ethan Aldridge's room. Traces of DNA belonging to Ethan Aldridge were found on it." This was the moment when everything became definitively clear. The container, in which, according to Caroline, she hauled trash, contained a direct link to the person she called her stepson. Chemical cleaning destroyed everything except one microscopic detail, stuck between the plastic and the rubber. And it was this detail that moved the case from speculation to a proven crime. Investigator Stevens would later say in his report, "This evidence became the point of no return. From this day, the investigation moved from the stage of suspicion to the stage of accusation. The container, which had become a symbol of mystery, now turned into a material answer. Everything that had previously seemed like conjectures and interpretations acquired a solid, documented form. Scientific precision replaced emotional versions, and beneath the layer of cleaning agent lay a truth that Caroline could not erase. This breakthrough changed the course of the entire case. Now the investigation had not just suspicion, but direct material evidence of a connection between Caroline and Ethan's disappearance. And from that moment, all of the RCMP's attention focused on one thing: where she disposed of what was in the container that night. When Caroline Aldridge entered the interrogation room for the last time, everything around her seemed to have lost its color. There was no usual nervousness, not even the familiar look of the investigator, which usually conveyed a slight compassion. The kind that appears in those who are not yet sure, but still hope to hear the truth. There was no room for hope here anymore. Only silence, the steady light of the lamp, and the rustle of papers as a new folder marked "Additional Examination" was placed on the table. Investigator Stevens sat opposite, but without his previous wariness. His face was calm, like a person who had done everything he could. Beside him was the district attorney, an elderly man with a tired look, and Caroline's lawyer, who looked as if the last few weeks had drained everything from him. He no longer tried to appear confident. On the contrary, he seemed to have already resigned himself to the outcome, understanding that what lay ahead was not a debate, but a statement of facts. The folder was placed in front of Caroline. She did not rush to open it. For several seconds, she just looked at it as something that could change reality, but would not change her fate. Then she opened it, slowly leafed through a few pages, her eyes gliding over technical phrases. Sample analysis, spectral identification, DNA profile confirmed. And finally, the third page. The name, the one that, despite all attempts at denial, had shadowed her for the past few months. Ethan Aldridge. She exhaled, without emotion, without tears. Just a short, heavy breath, as if all the air had left her chest. "Do you want to add anything to your testimony?" Stevens asked, without changing his tone. Caroline lowered her eyes. Her fingers clasped on the table did not tremble. "It's a mistake. I didn't do anything," she said quietly. Nothing more. No attempt to justify herself. No indignation, not even irritation. Just a cold, detached denial. When the prosecutor began to read excerpts from the report about microparticles, about the fiber match, about the impossibility of the fiber found under the seal being there accidentally, she did not raise her gaze. Only once did her pupils flicker when the phrase "high probability of direct contact with the object" was uttered. But even then, she did not say a word. The lawyer sitting next to her tried to catch her eye, as if reminding her, "Stay strong, do not react. Everything can be disputed in court." But she seemed no longer to be listening. Her inner world was closed from within, like a house with the lights off. The investigation understood. There would be no confession. And yet everyone in the room felt that it was no longer needed. The logical chain no longer required words. Digital data, chemistry, forensics, behavior, everything matched. 1 week after the presentation of the new evidence, the Manitoba prosecution completed the formation of the indictment package. The case materials occupied 3 thick folders. The first contained evidence, the second, interrogation and expert protocols, the third, accompanying documents, including the prosecutor's conclusion. The wording of the accusation was extremely precise and unemotional. Based on the collected evidence and the conclusions of forensic experts, Citizen Caroline Aldridge is recognized as a person for whom there are sufficient grounds to believe that she committed a criminal act, the intentional deprivation of Ethan Aldridge's life, accompanied by the concealment of traces and the destruction of evidence. The prosecutor emphasized in the report that the suspect's actions were consistent and deliberate, excluding the possibility of a crime of passion. The materials detailed that preparation for concealment began in advance, confirmed by online search activity, and the chemical treatment of the container indicated an intention to eliminate physical evidence. The case was transferred to the Manitoba Provincial Court. The cover bore the number 77B451, the same one that first appeared in the police report 3 months ago, when David Aldridge called 911 to report Ethan's disappearance. Only now, this number meant something different: the end of the investigation and the beginning of the judicial story. On February 14, 2023, Caroline Aldridge was officially charged with second-degree murder. That day, there was a peculiar silence in the Morris District Court building, as if the town knew that something irreversible was happening. Journalists stood at the entrance, but Caroline did not appear before the cameras. She was brought in through a side entrance, escorted by security. In the footage shot by local reporters, she looked the same, composed, almost lifeless. Neither fear nor remorse, only complete inner silence. At this stage, the investigation's work was complete. Now, the story passed into the hands of the court. Everything that had been collected bit by bit, documents, analyses, testimonies, digital traces, was to be transformed into a judicial dossier. Every word, every photograph, every expert examination would become the subject of dispute between the prosecution and the defense. Investigator Stevens wrote briefly in his report, "We found everything but a confession. But a confession is not the only proof of guilt. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any words." Thus ended one stage, the police stage, and another began, the judicial one, where questions are no longer asked, but truth is constructed according to the rules of law, and where Caroline Aldridge's story was to reach its logical conclusion, not in reports, but under oath, before a jury, to the sound of a wooden gavel. The courtroom was full. No shouting, no emotions, only even light and the rustle of papers. The prosecutor stood up and calmly stated, "Reconstruction of the events of the night of October 13 to 14, based on investigative data, expert analyses, and witness testimonies." This was the moment when everything disparate, collected over months, searches, evidence, technical reports, camera footage, came together into a single, chronologically precise chain. According to the prosecution, everything began around 8 in the evening. A neighbor from across the street heard muffled voices, an argument not loud, but tense. At the same time, a sharp surge of activity was recorded on Caroline's phone. Several quick search queries concerning the removal of biological traces and chemical agents. After 8:30, communication ceased. Investigators believe that the key event occurred within this interval. At 9:00 p.m., a call came into the police from David Aldridge. He reported Ethan missing. Later, the investigation established that at this moment, Caroline was at home, helping him write the statement. The prosecutor called this call a pre-planned element, part of a false alibi. cameras in the supermarket recorded David at the checkout at the exact same time, which cleared him of suspicion but confirmed that someone else in the house continued to act. From 9:30 p.m. to approximately 1:30 a.m., according to experts, the premises were being cleaned. Micro traces of corrosive substances, similar in composition to those Caroline had purchased 1 week before the incident, were found on the kitchen floor and in the laundry room. In the trash bin, remnants of gloves, cut wipes with bleach, traces of liquid used to clean pipes. It was during this period, criminologists believe, that Caroline cleaned the house perfectly, destroying almost everything that could indicate traces of a struggle. At 2:17 a.m., a surveillance camera at the city entrance recorded the Aldridge's car. The car was moving towards Highway 59. In the back seat was a plastic container, the same one later seized by the police. The characteristic glow of headlights on another observation camera matched the time. This allowed the route to be reconstructed. She drove along the ring road, then turned towards the old quarry. From 2:45 a.m. to approximately 3:15 a.m., according to the investigation's calculations, she was at an unidentified location. This time interval remained the only gap in the chronology. The car returned to the city at 3:32 a.m. In the footage, the same container, but the lid was already removed. The prosecutor listed all this without emotion, almost mechanically, but each point sounded like a separate blow. From these data, a clear, relentless sequence emerged: conflict, call, cleanup, disposal. The entire night turned into a cold chain of logical actions, behind which there was neither accident nor impulse, only methodicalness. And yet, one gap remained: the place where the journey ended. It was never found. This is simply explained. Caroline left her phone at home. No GPS, no cell network data, no car tracker. Every movement was thought out in advance, as if she knew that this would be the only way to cut off the trail. The prosecutor concluded the reconstruction with a short phrase: "We did not find remains, but we found enough to establish the fact of the crime." This reconstruction became a key element of the prosecution. The court accepted it as the basis for the hearings. And now, with the evidence forming a single picture, there was one last thing left, to see if it would stand the test of the jury. The trial began quietly, almost routinely, without fanfare or sensationalism. But beneath this external ordinariness, an undeniable tension was palpable. A silence hung in the air of the courtroom, as if everyone present understood that not just Caroline Aldridge's fate was being decided, but the answer to a question that had plagued the town for 1 year. Could someone be convicted of murder if the person themselves had never been found? From the first minutes, the defense built a simple but effective line: no body, no case. The lawyer, young but confident, repeated this almost like a mantra. He addressed the jury calmly, almost intimately, as if explaining not a legal subtlety, but common sense. He said, "The evidence is circumstantial. Everything is built on assumptions, on conjectures, on the interpretation of chemistry and digital traces, but not on facts confirmed by a body." And at one point it seemed his argument was working. Several jurors indeed began to exchange glances, but the prosecution was ready for this. The prosecutor stood and spoke evenly, restrainedly, but with an internal pressure that was felt in every word. He did not raise his voice, did not gesticulate. He simply, almost mathematically, laid out the chain of evidence before the jury. He did not argue with the defense. He simply showed that the absence of a body did not mean the absence of a crime. "Every piece of evidence is a link," he said, pausing after each phrase. "Individually, they are weak, but together, they form a chain. And this chain binds the accused to the crime more strongly than any confession. Digital traces, chemical analyses, behavioral inconsistencies, the attempt to clean the house, false testimonies, traces of fiber, all of these are not coincidences. This is a system, and a system always speaks louder than emotions." There was such a silence in the room that someone dropping a pen was audible. The prosecutor continued, moving to specifics. Photos of the container, the DNA report, car route data, browser timestamps were projected onto the screen. All of this transformed into a vivid, relentless picture. The testimonies of forensic experts became key moments of the trial. One after another, criminologists, chemists, and IT analysts testified. They did not play on emotions, only facts. The digital data expert showed the browser's temporary logs, explaining how and when files were deleted. The forensic chemist described in detail the composition of the reagents found in the Aldridge's home and pointed out the match of their chemical profile with what was discovered in the container. And then the microfiber specialist came forward, the very person who found the blue thread under the lid's seal. His conclusion became the turning point. The DNA on the fiber is identical. This is not a coincidence, not a statistical error. This is physical proof of contact, and it rules out any alternative version of events. After this, the defense's words sounded different. The lawyer tried to object, speaking of procedural violations, a broken chain of custody for evidence, and the possibility of sample substitution, but all of this was drowned out by the overall obviousness. The investigation had been conducted flawlessly. The jury's deliberation lasted 12 hours, all day, then through the night. Newspapers reported that water and coffee were brought out of the deliberation room several times. Reporters waited on the courthouse steps until morning. At 9 a.m. the next day, the jury foreman returned to the courtroom. Everyone stood. "We find Caroline Aldridge guilty of second-degree murder." A murmur, like a collective exhale, rippled through the courtroom. The judge nodded, thanked the jury, and, reading the verdict, pronounced, "Life imprisonment with eligibility for parole after 15 years. Caroline listened to everything standing, without uttering a word. Her face remained immobile, as if she were a spectator, not a participant. When she was let out of the room, she turned only once, towards the prosecutor, but not with hatred, rather with a quiet understanding that the game was over. Thus ended the Aldridge trial, one of the most discussed cases in Manitoba's history. The court found guilt without a confession and delivered a verdict without a body found. And therein lies the cold, frightening power of this case. Even silence proved not a salvation, but evidence. After the trial, the lives of everyone connected to the Aldridge case changed irrevocably. In the courtroom, where the verdict had been delivered, the air seemed to lose its density. David stood motionless, clutching the ring he had never put back on after Caroline's arrest. A few days later, he filed for divorce. No comments, no public statements. He simply disappeared. The house in Morris was sold almost immediately. The new owners didn't stay long. They say there was a strange silence, as if the house didn't want to accept strangers. David left. He was last seen at a gas station on the outskirts of Winnipeg. Then the trail went cold. Some claimed he moved in with relatives in Ontario, others that he went to the States. But one thing is known for sure. He never returned to Morris. He didn't appear for anniversaries, didn't answer letters, didn't contact the press. It was as if he was trying to erase not just his address, but the very memory of his past life, and the town. Morris took a long time to recover. Small towns thrive on rumors, but in this case, even rumors sounded muted. People didn't conspire, but seemed to collectively stop uttering her name. Caroline became a symbol of what could hide behind a facade of well-being, behind a manicured lawn and family photos on the refrigerator. In schools, teachers long avoided the topic of domestic violence, but it was after this case that new instructions for social services and an early response program appeared in the district. The neighbors, who used to call them an ideal family, decided to act differently. They raised money and created a small charity fund, Ethan's Memory. The fund's goal is simple: to help young people in difficult home situations. The organization is small, but it is known almost throughout the province. Its curator, a former school psychologist, said that the fund exists not out of a desire to forgive, but out of a desire to prevent recurrence. 6 months after the trial, a memorial stone appeared in the city park. It has no photo or date, only a short inscription: "May the light of those we love not fade." People bring toys, notes, flowers there, especially in autumn when fallen leaves make the stone almost invisible, but this makes it seem even quieter and warmer. Caroline is serving her sentence at a women's correctional facility in Santa Maria. At first she was withdrawn, didn't participate in conversations, didn't attend group sessions. She tried to appeal several times. All were rejected. In letters that journalists received through her lawyer, she continued to claim innocence. She was asked more than once where Ethan was. She invariably answered the same thing: "I don't know anything." Years later, her words still sound as cold. No one believes in their sincerity, but this persistent silence has become the last mystery of the Aldridge case. She was convicted, punished, but did not reveal the main thing, and in doing so, she seemed to have left the last word to herself. Today, the story of Caroline and Ethan is not just a criminal case. It is an example of how human indifference, unspoken words, and isolation can lead to tragedy. It is a story of how evil does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers, with a smile, in a kitchen where a soft light burns. And somewhere in Morris, on a quiet street by the river, the old Aldridge house still stands empty. The windows are boarded up, the grass has grown taller than the threshold, and only rare passers-by glance at the peeling sign by the gate. They say that in the evenings you can hear the basement door creak, but perhaps it's just the wind. Stories like this don't fade away. They remain like an echo. The police drove to the village near Białystok early in the morning. The reason for the visit seemed simple and routine. A complaint had come to the school from a teacher that Agatha had not attended classes for several weeks in a row. Such stories happen often. Parents leave to work, children remain under the care of relatives, and if there are health or discipline problems, the school informs child welfare services. Checking living conditions looks like the most standard bureaucratic procedure. Usually everything is limited to formalities. A police officer enters the house, records that everything is in order, talks to the guardian, and the story ends there. But this visit turned out to be the beginning of a completely different scenario. At the gate of the house, the law enforcement officers were met by the grandfather, Stanisław, who was already over 70. He came out calmly, even confidently, as if he had prepared for the visit in advance. The conversation was built on the premise that no check was needed. Stanisław assured them that his granddaughter was indeed ill, but he was taking care of her, and everything was under control. His tone was emotionless, and at first glance, this was reassuring. However, in parallel, he was clearly trying to limit their field of view. He showed the house, but persistently dissuaded them from going further into the yard. Most insistently, he forbade approaching the back of the plot, where old outbuildings were located. This seemed strange, and the officers immediately had a feeling that he was hiding something. When the grandfather repeated the same thing several times, the police presented a search warrant and continued their work without his permission. The situation shifted from a formal conversation to a concrete search. The house inside looked unassuming, but typical for rural life. Old furniture, piles of things, some visible clutter. However, nothing criminal was found in these rooms. The inspection gradually shifted to the yard. The police walked around the outbuildings and noticed an unusual object near the shed. There was a pit covered with boards, looking like an old cesspool. Against the backdrop of the rest of the surroundings, these boards stood out. They were fresh, recently nailed, and the edges of the wood had not yet darkened. The officers immediately paid attention to this. Approaching closer, they noticed that the boards were laid unevenly, as if someone had been in a hurry. The most important thing happened when one of the police officers leaned down and listened. A barely audible sound came from under the covering. Quiet, faint, but clearly human. After that, there could be no delays. The boards were quickly removed, opening the pit, and there below was Agatha. She was alive, but looked extremely weakened. It was clear that she had been in an enclosed space for a long time. An ambulance was immediately called. Medics arrived promptly to provide first aid and take her to the hospital. Simultaneously, the police documented the fact of the discovery and her condition. Stanisław at this moment no longer looked calm. His behavior became nervous. He tried to make excuses, but the fact was obvious. His granddaughter had been in his yard all this time. The formal check, which began as a routine bureaucratic procedure, instantly turned into a rescue operation. This moment became the starting point for a high-profile case, during which circumstances much darker and more complex than anyone could have imagined came to light. The Kowalski family lived for many years on the outskirts of a small village near Białystok. The house they inhabited was old but sturdy, of Soviet construction, a wooden facade, peeling paint on the windows, a low fence that had long needed repair. On the plot, a couple of sheds, a garden where potatoes and carrots were planted in spring, and an old well. All of this looked the same as hundreds of other families in the area. Externally, the house did not stand out. To the neighbors, it was part of the familiar landscape, where life flowed measuredly, without significant changes. Agatha's parents decided to go to Germany for work several years ago. This was typical for the region. Many men and women sought opportunities abroad to support their loved ones. The father got a job at a construction site. The mother worked as a cleaner. They transferred money regularly so that the household would not suffer. They were rarely seen in the village, only on holidays, and then only for a short time. Most of the time, their lives were spent far from the family. It seemed that all this was temporary, that they would soon return when they got on their feet. But time passed, and the return did not happen. The girl's official guardian became her grandfather, Stanislaw, an elderly man who was already over 70. The authorities formalized the documents. Everything was in order. The grandfather received the right to care for his granddaughter, receive benefits, and oversee her upbringing. On paper, it looked impeccable. The family was not on any register. No complaints came from the school or neighbors. No checks were assigned. Everything indicated that this was a perfectly ordinary family, with its own difficulties, but nothing critical. School records confirmed. Agatha attended classes regularly. She did not stand out among her classmates, was not confrontational or problematic. Teachers noted her as quiet, calm, not prone to unnecessary talk. Classmates also did not recall anything unusual about her. She was just like many others, almost unnoticeable against the background of the class. It was this normality that made her absence less noticeable in the first weeks. Neighbors also did not notice anything suspicious. Stanislaw went out into the yard, engaged in hozajstvom. He looked like a typical elderly rural man, strong though already hunched in an old cap and quilted jacket. His days passed uniformly. He fed the chickens, stoked the stove, sometimes dug in the garden beds. He went to the store regularly, bought groceries, greeted people. They knew him as a strict person, but not one who aroused suspicion. In their eyes, he was more gloomy and withdrawn than dangerous. No one could have assumed that something serious was hidden behind the closed doors of this house. Most importantly, the grandfather was the only adult in the house. All responsibility lay with him. He decided what his granddaughter ate, when she went to school, what she did. Parents from a distance could not check every little thing. Everything rested on trust. Stanislaw was the figure on whom everyday life depended. But the vulnerability of this situation was obvious. Control was practically impossible. If the grandfather said that Agatha was fine, they believed him. That is why alarm was not raised immediately. The last school attendance record dates back to a specific day, 3 months ago. At first, no one was alarmed. The grandfather explained, "She's sick. She's resting at home." This sounded familiar. Such situations happen regularly in rural schools. No one rushed to check. They took his word for it. For the first week, it seemed logical. For the second, still acceptable. But week after week, the situation remained the same. That day when Agatha last came to class became the turning point. It separated normal life from the period that would later be called the disappearance. For 3 months in a row, Agatha's name did not appear on school lists, was not marked in the class register. From this moment, a complete break with her accustomed world began in her life. Formally, the external picture continued to exist. The grandfather was busy with his affairs, neighbors saw him on the street, parents sent money. But in fact, everything had already changed. From that very day, the countdown of her absence begins. A countdown that would later lead to the most unexpected and shocking discovery. When absent notes began to appear more and more often next to Agatha's name in the school register, at first no one thought of the worst. Teachers were accustomed to illnesses, trips, and household chores occurring in rural families. However, here the situation dragged on. Weeks passed one after another, and the girl never returned to her desk. The first step was a usual conversation between the class teacher and Stanislaw. In a phone call, he simply said, "She is sick." His voice was confident, without alarm. This did not sound like a reason to raise an alarm. After a few more days, the grandfather began to specify, "She has a special ailment, not like others. I know what to do." These words were recorded in the protocol, but at the time, they were not perceived as a danger. It looked more like an old man's stubbornness or a belief in folk remedies than something criminal. Each time the teachers tried to get clarity, Stanislaw behaved the same way. He did not get nervous, did not shy away from the conversation, but simply repeated the same thing. "I am treating her in my own way," he would say. This phrase became key. It closed all questions. No one could seize on it as a formal violation because there was no direct refusal of medical help. He promised to bring a doctor's note, but week after week passed, and he never presented any documents. When reminded of the note, he either changed the subject or replied evasively, "I'll go tomorrow, don't worry." In practice, this meant one thing: to stall for time. Why wasn't the alarm raised earlier? The reason lies in the system. For official services to intervene, a clear formal reason is needed. Skipping classes in itself is not yet a signal for an emergency check if there is an explanation from the guardian. And Stanisław always had one, either a cold or a special illness, or a promise to show medical papers. Formally, the school could not immediately call the police. The grounds were too vague. The teachers recorded everything, but until the moment of an official statement, all of this remained within internal papers. Meanwhile, time passed. The teacher did not give up attempts to contact the family. She regularly called the home phone, but only heard Stanisław himself in response. Agatha's parents were abroad, and it turned out to be almost impossible to reach them directly. Social networks, messengers, none of this was used in that family. Only dry official correspondence and rare calls remained, and each time, the grandfather repeated the same words. His strategy was simple: to give answers that sounded unusual but not criminal. Gradually, the teacher's patience was running out. She went through all the prescribed stages, recorded absences in the register, sent internal reports to the principal, made notes in reports. Then she sent inquiries to social services, trying to force the system to react. But the result was the same: waiting for a certificate. Everything came down to the grandfather's promises and the lack of direct evidence of a threat. A month passed, then a second. When the third month arrived, it became clear that the situation was abnormal. 3 months of absence is too long for a common illness. The teacher realized that she could not wait any longer. She filed an official statement with the authorities. This was already a different level, a document with legal force, signed and registered. Such a document could not be ignored. It was this statement that became the turning point. Now the case ceased to be an internal school matter and fell within the competence of the police. It became the basis for the police squad to go out on that very day we spoke about at the beginning. From that moment, the story ceased to be a set of strange explanations and entered the realm of criminal investigation. This was the transitional boundary from words and promises to the actions of law enforcement. When doctors admitted Agatha after the ambulance call, the first thing they did was a full examination. Her condition was extremely severe, pronounced exhaustion, dehydration, sleep, and eating disorders. Doctors recorded low body weight, weakened muscles, and traces of prolonged exposure to cold and damp conditions. At the same time, the medical examination noted that there were no signs of systematic beatings. This turned out to be a crucial detail. All her suffering was related precisely to the conditions of her confinement, not to direct physical assault. Such a difference was very important for the investigation, as it determined the possible qualification of the grandfather's actions and gave hope for her health recovery. For the investigation, the key conclusion was that despite all the agonizing circumstances, there was no threat to her life at the moment of discovery. Agatha could recover, and most importantly, she was able to speak and, in perspective, give testimony. This changed the whole picture. Now the investigation had not only a set of circumstantial evidence, but also the opportunity to obtain direct testimony from the victim herself. In the context of a criminal process, such a prospect was decisive. In parallel, attention shifted to Stanisław. His arrest took place immediately on the spot, after the official documentation of the discovery. The procedural actions looked standard. He was taken to the station, interrogated, and the circumstances were recorded. In the first hours, he was officially charged under the article, "Unlawful Deprivation of Liberty of a Person Under His Guardianship." This was the most obvious and confirmed formulation at that time. During interrogations, Stanisław remained relatively calm. He did not deny the fact of isolation itself. Denial was senseless. But when it came to motives, he resorted to evasive answers. His main words sounded the same. "I treated her in my own way. It was necessary. I wanted her to get well." For investigators, these phrases became not just strange, but a direct signal. There was some internal logic in this story that he himself followed. Investigators understood. Stanisław's words might be connected to a certain belief system or external influence. Therefore, a search of the house became the next step. The rooms were checked sequentially: kitchen, bedroom, living room. And there, where they expected to find medicines, medical documents, or items related to care, they found something entirely different. On the table and in the drawers were dozens of handwritten sheets of paper. These were not ordinary notes, but drawings, diagrams, circles, arrows, incomprehensible symbols. In places they resembled either primitive blueprints or mystical signs. Next to them were icons, candles, and old prayer books. All of this together looked like a set of items that the grandfather worked with regularly. These drawings were immediately seized and added to the case. They had no relation to medicine, did not explain how one could treat an illness. On the contrary, they looked like a personal summary, or the result of consultations with people who tried to convince Stanisław of the existence of special methods. For the investigation, the find was extremely important. It showed that Agatha's isolation was not a random improvisation. Behind the words, "I treat her in my own way," stood a specific system of beliefs, and this already opened a new line of investigation, to understand who or what pushed Stanisław to such a decision, and whether he was truly alone in this story. Thus, the first inspection of the house yielded not only evidence, but also a direction for the development of the case. From Agatha's condition and the formulation of the accusation, the investigation now moved to finding a deeper motive. This became the bridge to the next stage of the investigation. At the first official interrogation, Stanisław immediately defined his sole line of conduct. He not only denied all accusations, but also tried to show that he himself was in the position of a victim of misunderstanding. His words sounded firm, his intonations confident, and even in the protocol, investigators recorded that the man showed neither anxiety nor nervousness. He appeared calm, reasonable, as if discussing a domestic issue, and not explaining the 3-month confinement of his own granddaughter in inhumane conditions. From the very beginning, he emphasized, "I did nothing wrong. My decision was solely driven by care. I treated her as I knew how." This phrase became a kind of core of his defense and was repeated by him again and again. For the investigators, this looked like a strategy, to admit the fact, but distort its meaning. Not to deny the actions, but to completely deny intent. He then moved on to detailed descriptions of what prompted the treatment. According to him, his granddaughter began to change, and he perceived these changes exclusively in a negative light. Stanisław listed a whole set of symptoms. Among them were stubbornness, frequent conflicts over trifles, refusal to comply with requests, and a strong attachment to her phone. He claimed that she spent too much time on the internet, argued with him, sat in her room for long periods, and did not listen to his remarks. From the point of view of educators or psychologists, these looked like ordinary manifestations of adolescence. But for Stanisław, all of this became an alarm signal. He said, "She seemed to stop being herself. She argued, looked at the screen, not at me. I saw something alien in it." In his view, this was not just disobedience or adolescence, but some kind of possession or illness that needed to be cured. It is important that at this moment, Stanisław repeatedly stated that he did not perceive his behavior as a crime. In his system of coordinates, what was happening was part of some ritual, a way to draw the illness out. The protocols preserved a key phrase, "I treated her in my own way." Investigators noted this was not a slip of the tongue, but a stable expression that he used many times. In fact, he created an internal justification for himself, and this justification completely replaced his understanding of legal norms. When it came to who suggested this particular method of isolation, Stanisław behaved differently. If before he spoke confidently, at this moment he began to get confused. He denied that the idea belonged exclusively to him. According to him, everything happened under the influence of advice. He mentioned several times a certain person whom he trusted. This person, in his version, possessed special knowledge and assured him that such measures would help exorcise the illness. Stanisław referred to him as an authority, repeating, "I didn't invent it. I was told that this would be right. I listened to someone who knows better." For the investigation, this became a critical moment. Until then, the whole case looked like a tragic story within one family, where an elderly guardian, due to personal beliefs, distorted reality. But after his words, it became clear that another person might be involved in the situation. Someone who exerted influence, shaped beliefs, and effectively pushed Stanisław to act. This meant that the scope of the investigation needed to be expanded, additional contacts sought, the surroundings checked, and it had to be established who exactly could have acted as a counselor. Thus, Stanisław's initial testimony did not answer questions, but rather created a new layer. His version of treatment only emphasized the gap between reality and his perception, but most importantly, his mention of a third party took the story beyond a personal conflict. Investigators had a lead. Now they had to figure out who this person was and what role they played in the chain of events that led to the tragic outcome. Stanisław, whose figure gradually became key in the entire case, at first glance did not arouse suspicion. He had always been a part of this village, a man known to many, but about whom few could say anything substantial. His life seemed simple: farm work, routine duties, no vivid events. But it was precisely in this inconspicuousness that the first important detail lay. He never stood out, never sought attention, lived in the shadows. After his wife died, the usual order finally collapsed. At first, he tried to cling to his usual activities, cultivating the garden, tending to the livestock, but gradually his interest in these pursuits faded. People in the village recalled he became different. At first, this manifested itself in him simply talking less, but then he began to avoid communication altogether, stopped attending village meetings, stopped greeting people first. All of this happened gradually, so no one saw anything criminal in it. But it was during this period that his slow detachment from reality began. When investigators began to study his past in more detail, they paid attention to how his behavior changed. An ordinary working man who had managed the household all his life turned into a recluse. He had no friends left, and relatives, except for his son, did not maintain close ties. In conversations with neighbors, he was not mentioned as conflictual or aggressive, rather the opposite, as an eccentric living to himself. His loneliness stretched for years, and gradually it became a norm to which everyone became accustomed. Particular attention was paid to checking his phone contacts. Agatha's parents regularly sent money and tried to call at least once a week, but conversations with Stanisław were monotonous, short, dry, limited to everyday topics. According to operators, most calls lasted no more than 1 minute. In rare cases, when the conversation dragged on, it was about mail or utility bills. He never said that there were problems with his granddaughter, and this was a key point. During the investigation, it turned out, even when the teacher tried to directly contact the parents, the grandfather intercepted the communication and arranged the situation so that they would suspect nothing. His behavior was structured to completely exclude the risk of outside interference. But the most revealing part of the picture emerged during the search of his house. The house looked normal from the outside. Old furniture, icons, photographs of his wife. But upon closer inspection, operatives discovered materials that did not fit the image of an ordinary retiree at all. These were dozens of books, many in poor condition, with dog-eared pages and notes in the margins. Among them were religious texts, brochures about miraculous healings, newspaper clippings about folk healers. A separate layer consisted of publications on rituals and magical practices. There were notebooks with neatly rewritten symbols, diagrams, descriptions of rituals. Some pages were clearly used as a guide to action. Phrases circled in red pen, underlined words like cleansing, correction, illness. Investigators made an important conclusion. Stanisław's reality had long ceased to be shared with those around him. He did not perceive the world through communication with people. His perception was formed precisely by these books and texts. For many years, he lived in an information bubble, completely isolated from critical scrutiny. He had no interlocutors who could object or explain the absurdity of his views. Everything he read, he accepted as truth. That is why his explanation for his actions seemed logical and justified to him. He did not see a crime in it. He saw a method. For the investigation, this discovery was crucial. It showed that the grandfather did not act spontaneously, was not guided by a sudden impulse. His act was built within a system of beliefs that had been formed over years under the influence of an isolated environment and literature. But even more important was that in his testimony, he mentioned advice from an outsider, This meant that it was necessary to find out who exactly was behind these ideas and could directly influence his actions. This opened a new direction of investigation that could lead beyond the Kowalski house itself. When investigators began to thoroughly examine the contents of the box where Stanisław's drawings and papers were kept, it became clear. These were not random notes. Every page had a structure. On some sheets, he literally drew a map of his plot, marking the house, the shed, the garden, and separately, the old cesspool behind the house. These plans were crudely made but clear enough. The contours of the objects were drawn so that it was understandable that he was orienting himself precisely to his own yard. Most unsettling, in the center of the pit, was a small figure, depicted schematically but unmistakably associated with a person. For investigators, this became proof that such actions were prepared in advance and could not have been a spontaneous reaction. Handwriting experts confirmed all inscriptions on the sheets were made by Stanisław himself. The paper looked old, in places yellowed, here and there with moisture stains. However, the ink was well preserved, and the inscriptions were easily readable. In the margins and between the lines were words and short phrases. There were phrases like, "cleansing with earth," "darkness heals," "silence is medicine." These comments were not accidental. They reflected his way of thinking and how he justified his actions. Investigators noted these records directly echoed the books found in the house, which spoke of folk methods of getting rid of ailment through isolation and contact with the earth. Particular attention was drawn to the fact that there were several such diagrams. In one drawing, the pit was depicted from above, with the inscription, "Prohibition." In another, in cross-section, where the boards used to cover it were clearly drawn. In another version, there was a note, "Silence," as if this was a key condition. Such a sequence indicated systematicness. He was not just making a one-time sketch, but step by step building a model of his treatment. In the investigation materials, such documents played the role not of an illustration, but of direct evidence. The person planned and documented his actions in advance. For lawyers, the presence of such diagrams became a turning point. In criminal proceedings, it is important to determine whether the accused acted under the influence of an instantaneous impulse, or whether he thought everything through in advance. If it were only about his words during interrogations, he could claim that he acted thoughtlessly, that it was an emotional breakdown. But the presence of drawings and notes ruled out such a version. This was no longer spontaneity, but premeditation, and therefore, the article of accusation became more serious, and the punishment more severe. Besides the legal component, these papers gave investigators reason to consider the question of possible external influence. After all, formulations such as "cleansing with earth" or "darkness heals" rarely arise by themselves. A theory emerged that Stanisław might have drawn these ideas not only from books, but also from communication with someone from outside. Perhaps someone instilled such methods in him, someone who called himself a healer or a witch doctor. There was no direct evidence of this at the time, but the discovery itself allowed the investigation to expand the boundaries of the inquiry. Thus, the drawings and diagrams, which at first glance might have seemed like a strange household habit of an elderly person, turned into one of the most weighty pieces of evidence. They showed his way of thinking, documented the preparation process, and finally convinced the investigation. Everything that happened was not an accident. This was a planned process, and therefore, the accusation against him became much more serious. It was from this moment that the case ceased to be perceived as a family conflict or a misunderstanding and turned into a serious criminal investigation. After the strange drawings and papers, on which Stanisław personally outlined symbols and diagrams, appeared in the case files, investigators faced the need to obtain an unambiguous answer from specialists. It was obvious the further development of the case depended on the mental state of this person at the moment when he decided to imprison Agatha and subsequently acted. Without an expert opinion, it was impossible to understand whether he should bear criminal responsibility or whether his actions could be explained by a severe mental disorder that deprived him of the ability to account for his actions. To this end, a comprehensive psychological and psychiatric examination was ordered and conducted in a specialized institution. The procedure lasted for several weeks. Stanisław underwent a series of tests, observations, and was interviewed by experts in various formats, from short verification questions to lengthy interviews. In parallel, specialists studied all the case materials, interrogation protocols, records of his explanations, texts he left on paper, and the results of the search of his house. Every detail was considered from the perspective of whether signs of mental pathology could be seen behind it. Special attention was paid to Stanisław's worldview. During interrogations, he openly stated that he believed in the existence of evil spirits, that he considered darkness a way of cleansing, and the earth a medicine. In his notes, phrases like cleansing with earth, darkness heals were found, and these very words became the subject of analysis by specialists. Experts emphasized, such ideas in themselves are not proof of a psychiatric diagnosis. In psychology, this phenomenon is called magical thinking, when a person explains what is happening through mystical or irrational concepts, instead of relying on facts and scientific knowledge. It was important to draw a clear line between such a worldview and actual psychiatric disorders. The commission checked whether Stanisław showed signs of delusions, hallucinations, or perception disorders. He was thoroughly examined, how he oriented himself in space, whether he remembered dates, whether he could consistently reproduce events, whether he answered questions logically. The results were telling. Despite all the strangeness of his beliefs, he answered coherently, thought consistently, and did not lose touch with reality. Psychologists noted that such thinking could have formed due to years of isolation. After his wife's death, Stanisław almost stopped communicating with neighbors, had no friends, and rarely left his yard. His social circle was limited, and his main source of knowledge became books and notes he found in old publications and from local healers. Over time, he became withdrawn into this narrow world where the line between faith and reality blurred. But at the same time, he retained the ability to control his actions and was aware of the consequences of what he was doing. The commission's conclusion was clear and unambiguous. Stanisław Kowalski was deemed sane. This means that his actions cannot be explained by a severe mental illness. He understood the nature of his deeds, was aware that he was depriving his granddaughter of freedom, that he was confining her in a pit, and that he was hiding all of this from others. And most importantly, he was capable of controlling his behavior. For the court, this finding was crucial. From that moment on, it became clear. The defense line, which could have been built on the insanity version, was definitively ruled out. Stanisław is subject to full criminal liability. Now, the investigation focused on something else, on finding the ultimate motive explaining why he did all this, and exactly how the events leading to the tragedy unfolded. After official examinations confirmed Stanisław's sanity, and it became clear that he could not avoid responsibility on medical grounds, investigators focused on another direction, checking all third-party figures mentioned in his testimonies. One such figure was a local healer whom Stanisław mentioned several times as a counselor. He claimed that this person allegedly suggested unusual methods of cleansing and getting rid of illness. For the investigation, such statements always become an important point. If there is a third-party participant, it is necessary to ascertain the extent of their involvement, even if it initially seems to be a fabrication or an attempt to shift blame. First, the police identified the person mentioned. It was an elderly man from a neighboring district who indeed received people, calling himself a healer or curer. His reputation was well known. Some were skeptical, considering him a common imposter, while others, on the contrary, believed that he helps with words and herbs. But no one had any information that he had ever advised anything radical or outside the bounds of usual folk practices. Nevertheless, the investigation was obliged to check everything thoroughly without making allowances for rumors. The healer was summoned for an official interrogation. He did not deny his acquaintance with Stanisław. He confirmed that Stanisław had indeed come to him several times, complaining about family problems, saying that not all was peaceful at home, that the granddaughter was behaving strangely, that there was unclean energy. The healer himself recounted that he replied in general terms. He advised more quiet, peace, fewer irritants, to try prayer, reading holy texts. He emphasized that he never spoke of pits, yard structures, or physical isolation. All of this he called exclusively Stanisław's fantasies, who, perhaps, understood his words in his own way. Investigators clarified the details again and again. Did he give direct instructions? Did he call for restricting contacts or for harsh methods? The answer was emphatic: no. The record documented his denial of any instructions for such actions. He admitted only one thing: the phrase, "one must cast out negativity," fence oneself off from it. But in his interpretation, this simply meant a common expression: spend less time with those who bring bad energy. In parallel, officers began to gather additional information. They checked phone connections between him and Stanislav. Technical expertise confirmed, for the entire period of interest to the investigation, there were practically no contacts. A few short calls were recorded many months ago, and their duration did not exceed a couple of minutes. In correspondence, nothing. No messages, no letters, no notes that could indicate specific instructions. Stanislav's neighbors were interviewed. No one had seen the healer in the village. No one had noticed him coming to the house or showing interest in the family's fate. There were no witnesses who could confirm regular communication. The impression increasingly formed. A meeting could indeed have occurred. Conversations were held, but they were vague and superficial, and Stanislav himself gave them a completely different meaning. The investigation carefully examined the suspect's house. Special attention was paid to notes and papers found during the search. Indeed, there were phrases like "earth cleansing," "darkness heals." But the handwriting belonged to Stanislav himself, and nowhere was there any mention of the healer as the author of these ideas. There were no business cards, no letters, no recorded instructions. Experts concluded the source of these thoughts was the homeowner himself, not a third person. Ultimately, it became clear that the direct involvement of the counselor was not confirmed. His role was limited to casual conversations in which he uttered general phrases characteristic of any person believing in negativity and cleansing. Everything else was the result of Stanislav's interpretation and independent actions. Legally, this was of great significance. Charges could not be brought without facts, and therefore, the procedural decision was unambiguous. There was no evidence, the testimonies contained no direct indications of criminal acts, and there were no witnesses. Based on this, the version involving complicity was closed. Officially, the healer was excluded from the list of suspects. No charges were brought against him. He was involved in the case as a witness, but no more. All arrows again pointed to only one person, Stanislav. It was he who made the decisions. It was he who carried out his plans. It was he who bore full responsibility. And although the lead with the healer turned out to be a false one, it played its part. Investigators were able to show that they thoroughly checked all versions, followed up on all contacts, and now nothing distracted from the main point. The story returned to the figure of the grandfather, who remained at the center of the investigation. Ahead was an analysis of the motives, the sequence of his actions, and the details that would ultimately determine the severity of the accusation. Once the investigation was definitively convinced that the healer version was not substantiated, attention shifted to Stanislav's immediate circle. It was at this moment that Agata's parents returned to Poland. They were summoned for official questioning to provide explanations about what they knew about life in the house and how well they understood their father's character. Already in the first protocols, an important detail emerged. They admitted that they had always known about his superstitions and strange views. The mother explicitly stated that her father could talk for hours about spirits, curses, and how objects can influence a person. The father of the family also did not deny that he had long been accustomed to these conversations. They perceived it as a manifestation of old age, but by no means as a real threat. These words were key. They meant that the parents could not have failed to notice the grandfather's peculiarities. Moreover, they were aware of his tendency towards atypical interpretations of events. However, they took no action. They did not consider it necessary to limit his role in upbringing, or even to regularly check what was actually happening in the house. For the investigation, this became an important signal. Responsibility lies not only with Stanislav, but also with those who left their daughter under his complete control. During interrogations, the parents tried to explain themselves. They referred to circumstances. According to them, working in Germany was the only way to support the family. The money they earned was sent home, and without this support, it would have been impossible to maintain the household and pay for schooling. They said they called constantly, asking about the situation, and each time Stanislav assured them, "Everything is fine. She's sick, but I'm managing." They took these assurances at face value, in their understanding their father was an elderly but responsible person whom they could trust. And legally, these words appeared weak. For the investigation, such justifications did not absolve them of guilt. The law states it clearly: if parents entrust guardianship to a third party, they are still obligated to monitor the living conditions. Lack of control is interpreted as a failure to fulfill duties. The protocols recorded this. The parents' inaction may have legal consequences. However, this was a separate line of work for the prosecutor's office, but it reinforced the context of the overall story. Against the backdrop of these testimonies, a picture of the conflict that became the real trigger gradually emerged. Up until this point, many details remained unclear. However, it was after the parents' return that investigators received new testimony from Agatha herself. She was ready to elaborate on what exactly became the starting point of her isolation. From her words, it followed that a quarrel erupted between her and her grandfather. This happened shortly before she disappeared from school and stopped appearing outside. The essence of the conflict revolved around one item: the phone. For a teenager, it was a way to communicate with friends, a window to the world. For Stanislav, however, it became a symbol of alien influence. His expressions preserved in the protocols called the phone a window for the devil, a source of corruption. According to Agatha, her grandfather tried to forcibly take the device. She resisted. They yelled at each other. This moment became a turning point. The quarrel ended with the grandfather declaring, "This cannot continue. I will cure you." This detail radically changed the picture. Until then, his motives could have been interpreted as an abstract fascination with mysticism. But it was the conflict over the phone that revealed the real reason. In his perception, technology became the enemy, and his granddaughter, the carrier of this influence. He decided that he had to act. And this decision led to the events that ultimately became the subject of judicial proceedings. Thus, Stanislav's dark past lay not only in his superstitions and isolation from society, but also in how he projected these ideas onto his loved ones. The parents knew about his quirks but ignored them, and the conflict with his granddaughter became the final push, turning delusions into concrete actions. It was here that the investigation gained a new level of understanding of the motives, and from then on, investigators could proceed to the final analysis of how these motives would be qualified in court. Stanislav's final interrogation went into the case file as the most tense part of the entire investigation. Investigators understood that this was where the final point needed to be made, to demolish all the defensive versions he had built over many weeks. All the preparatory work led up to this moment. The interrogation room looked ordinary: a table, 2 chairs, a folder with papers, a voice recorder. But the atmosphere was different. One could feel in the air that the outcome of this conversation would be decisive. Stanislav sat calmly, but his gaze no longer held its former confidence. He understood that every phrase he uttered was being recorded and would be used against him. The investigator began methodically and without unnecessary emotion. First, he raised the question of the healer Stanislav had referred to from the very beginning. According to the accused, it was this person who allegedly convinced him of the necessity of isolation. It was on to him that he shifted responsibility. But now the case contained official protocols. The investigator opened the folder and read out the healer's testimony. Yes, he came. Yes, he spoke of family problems. But I gave him no advice about confinement, or even about using a pit. For Stanislav, this was a blow. His main line of defense was crumbling. He averted his gaze, fell silent, as if trying to come up with a new version. But the fact was obvious. He could no longer hide behind someone else's words. The investigator continued, not allowing the pause to linger. The psychiatric expert's conclusion was placed on the table. This document was the result of several weeks of observations, conversations, tests, and medical examinations. The final conclusion was clear and unambiguous. Stanislav Kowalski is sane. He is capable of understanding the nature of his actions and directing them. For the defense, this was the second blow. Any talk of insanity, of him allegedly not being aware of what was happening, was officially refuted. The investigator read these lines aloud, and a heavy silence fell in the room. After this, Stanislav tried to hold on. He spoke of wanting to help, of having no malicious intent. He repeated his phrases, which he had uttered before. I treated her in my own way. I wanted to free her from dark influence. But now these words sounded different. Without the support of the healer, and without the possibility of pleading insanity, his explanations seemed empty. The investigator listened attentively, without interrupting, but as soon as Stanislav finished, he immediately brought him back to the facts. And it was at this moment that the climax arrived. Agata's testimony was placed on the table. The protocol contained a detailed description of the conflict that preceded the confinement. It all began with a simple argument over a smartphone. She resisted. He demanded the device. In his words, it was a window for the devil, a source of corruption and possession. Agata recounted that after the quarrel, he said, "This is the last straw." The investigator read this fragment and directly asked, "Did you lock her up because of the phone?" This remark was decisive. Stanislav was silent at first. The protocol noted he lowered his head, his hands trembling. For several seconds he avoided the investigator's gaze, but then he quietly uttered, "Yes, that was the last straw. She wouldn't listen to me. I decided I had to act." After that, he no longer resisted. He began to give detailed testimony. He recounted how he prepared the pit, how he convinced himself that he was acting correctly, how he believed that darkness and isolation were part of cleansing. His words were recorded line by line, and with each new phrase, it became clear this was not an accident, not a spontaneous act, but actions he had thought about and prepared in advance. This interrogation put an end to the investigation. Now the case contained not only evidence, witness testimonies, and expert conclusions, but also the confession of the accused himself. The defense line completely collapsed. Stanislav stopped denying his involvement and described in detail the motives that guided him. For the investigation, this meant one thing. The picture of events came together as a whole. From this moment, the case moved into its final phase, preparation for trial, where each of these documents, every word uttered during the interrogation, would become a key argument for the prosecution. After Stanislav's confession, investigators were able to verify his every word, every detail he named, and compare them with real objects and evidence found in the house. It was important for them to separate fabrications and attempts to mitigate guilt from facts that were genuinely corroborated. During one of the lengthy interrogations, he himself, almost in passing, mentioned Agata's smartphone. According to him, that's where the most acute conflict began. Stanislav said that on the very first day of the quarrel, he took the phone and showed it to no one else. This detail immediately caught the investigators' attention because during previous searches, no gadgets had been found in the house. The investigator asked clarifying questions. Where exactly was the phone? What condition might it be in? Who else knew about its existence? Stanislav hesitated a little, remained silent for a long time, and then confessed. He had hidden the device in an old stove that had not been used for its intended purpose for a long time. He even described in detail how he created the hiding place. Behind a metal plate, in the void between the bricks, he carefully placed the item and disguised it with a cloth so that no one would accidentally stumble upon it. His words sounded so detailed that the investigators had no doubt. It was worth checking immediately. For this purpose, an additional search was organized. The group included operatives, forensic experts, and witnesses. Everything was documented with photos and in protocols so that the result would have legal force in court. First, they dismantled the upper part of the stove, then removed some bricks. And at the moment the niche was opened, the suspicions were confirmed. There indeed was a smartphone, wrapped in a piece of old rags. Traces of time were visible on it. Dust, small debris, a smell of dampness. But the device itself was preserved. It was seized, packed in special bags, and sent for technical expertise. This moment became crucial in the case. The find had not only material value, but also immense semantic significance. After all, this very object was the cause of the conflict between Stanislav and Agata. Now, it was clear that it was not about mysticism, not about rituals, and not about the advice of dubious healers. It all boiled down to a domestic dispute. The grandfather did not accept her interest in modern technologies, considered the smartphone evil, and wanted to completely control her life. The phone became a symbol of this confrontation, material evidence that the true motive was related to control and not to fabricated stories about spiritual practices. For the investigation, this meant a serious breakthrough. Now they had not only a confession, which could be challenged, but also direct evidence found where the accused himself indicated. This fact could not be explained by coincidence or error. The smartphone became the point that connected Agata's words, Stanislav's testimony, and the picture of the crime into a single whole. Now the investigation could confidently state the grandfather acted not in a state of delusion or under external influence, but out of his desire to suppress his granddaughter's will and deprive her of independence. After the discovery of the phone, the course of the investigation changed. The case became stricter and more unambiguous. Investigators understood that this piece of evidence would be one of the central ones in court. It showed not only the motive, but also the sequence of Stanislav's actions, proved his premeditation, and gave a clear explanation of what happened. Now, the final stage remained: preparation for the trial, where all this evidence was to be officially presented and legally evaluated. When the investigation gathered its materials, the moment everyone was waiting for arrived: the final reconstruction of events. This was the turning point, when cold facts replaced assumptions, and the suspect's confused words turned into concrete details recorded in the protocols. At this stage, there were no emotional outbursts or loud statements. Everything sounded dry and mundane, but in this mundane calm lay a frightening power. The man whose actions shocked everyone sat before the investigator and calmly, without hesitation, step by step, described what he had done and why. He began with the very first episode, when everything crossed the line. According to him, the argument erupted over a smartphone. For him, this item was a symbol of decay, danger, a window through which something alien entered the house. He convinced himself that it was the source of all the bad things happening to Agata. He had repeatedly made remarks, demanded she give up the device, but each time met with refusal. The moment she once again pushed his hand away and wouldn't let him take the phone, Stanislav perceived it not as a teenager's natural resistance, but as a sign of complete loss of control. In his mind, it looked like confirmation of his own dark theory. His granddaughter was possessed by an alien will. From that moment, he stopped viewing the situation as a family conflict. In his words, a harsh logic emerged. I realized that talking was useless. She doesn't hear me. So, she needs to be locked up, cut off from everything that poisons. It was then that he decided on complete isolation. He described it as the only way to re-educate her. Stanislav was confident that by depriving Agata of external temptations, he would break her resistance and return her to a proper life. But the most frightening part of his confession is how he himself justified his actions. He spoke of spirits, of impurity, of earth that cleanses. All these words in his mouth sounded like some ritual code, but in reality, they served merely as a cover. It was a convenient legend he used to mask his harshness, and it seemed he sincerely believed in it himself. The investigator noted in the protocol that behind the mystical facade lay a completely earthly motivation: the desire for complete control over a person who refused to obey. The investigation paid special attention to the question of duration. When asked for how long he intended to keep her in isolation, he gave no answer in numbers or days. Instead, Stanislav uttered a phrase that sounds particularly chilling: until she reforms. In this until lay all the danger of the situation. There was no calendar, no boundaries, not even his own internal limit. His plan was initially indefinite, and this meant he was prepared to keep her confined for weeks, months, as long as he deemed necessary. These confessions finally dispelled any doubts. They transformed the case from a vague tangle of contradictions into a clearly outlined scenario. First, the conflict over the phone, then his interpretation through the prism of superstitions, then the decision for isolation, and finally, an indefinite term dictated by his own will. All this showed that there was no sudden breakdown or accidental act. Stanislav's actions had an internal logic constructed by himself, and it was precisely for this reason that they posed a particular danger. Now, for the court and for society, the story gained clarity. Behind the mystical veil, behind talks of rituals and cleansing, lay a far more prosaic, yet no less terrifying reality. It was not a ritual, but a system of pressure. It was not healing, but methodical isolation, designed to subjugate another person's will. And it was this picture that formed the basis of the accusation, which was preparing to move to the next stage. Now, investigators were able to reconstruct a full and rather grim picture of what the 3 months of confinement looked like. These details are shocking not so much by external signs of cruelty as by their cold, systematic nature and ordinariness. No outbursts, no vivid manifestations of rage or fear. Everything that happened looked like a cold-blooded, premeditated process that became part of Stanislav's daily life. The crime scene inspection provided a clear understanding of the conditions Agata was kept in. The pit was old and had once been used as a cellar for storing vegetables. Its walls were lined with brick, making the space dry and quite sturdy. On the floor lay the remnants of an old, long-worn mattress, which Stanislav had thrown down to create a minimal semblance of comfort. The boards he used to cover the pit were heavy, weighed down from above with metal rods and stones to make the structure appear intentionally stationary. Narrow gaps remained between the boards, through which air and faint light penetrated. These conditions could not be called lethal, but they deprived any possibility of leading a normal life. The person found themselves in a state of complete isolation, where every day turned into a struggle for survival, rather than existence in the usual sense of the word. Stanislav, as the investigation showed, turned this into a routine. According to his own words, he acted on schedule. Once a day, he would shift one of the boards, opening a narrow aperture, and lower a plastic bottle of water and some simple piece of food through a rope. A piece of bread, boiled potatoes, sometimes a plate of porridge in a tin bowl. He did not linger by the opening, did not engage in conversation, did not try to explain what was happening in any way. His actions were limited to maintaining minimal living conditions. For him, this was an element of the process, not care for a loved one. It is also important to note the psychological impact. He consciously avoided communication, depriving Agata not only of freedom, but also of any emotional support. Even a short phrase, even an attempt to comfort, could have created the illusion of human contact. But he chose complete silence. This turned every day into a closed cycle, waiting for the rare moment when the hatch opened to receive water and food, and then silence again, darkness again, loneliness again. For Agata, this factor was especially difficult. Meanwhile, outside, Stanislav continued to lead a life that aroused not the slightest suspicion in those around him. Neighbors saw him in the shop. He bought a standard set of groceries, bread, matches, milk. Sometimes he stopped by neighboring fences, exchanging a few words about the weather or garden work. These conversations were always short and detached, and this surprised no one. In the village, he had long been known as a withdrawn, unsociable person. And this trait, which had been perceived as a normal character feature for decades, ultimately became his perfect cover. No one expected openness from him, and therefore no one noticed that a secret was hidden behind his silence. Even in his dealings with official structures, he acted carefully. He answered calls from teachers, always repeating the same phrase: "She is sick, she needs rest." These words did not sound threatening, but rather mundane, and it was this mundaneness that was misleading. It seemed there was no reason for urgent alarm. Formally, there was nothing in his words that would give grounds for immediate intervention. But behind this standard explanation lay a carefully constructed lie. Gradually, the investigation formed a picture. For 3 months, Agata was in isolation, where physical survival was minimally maintained and psychological pressure intensified every day. Stanislav lived in 2 realities. To the outside world, he remained a quiet old man living in his village, and within his own yard, he transformed into a supervisor who controlled every moment of his granddaughter's life. This duality proved to be the key to understanding how the crime managed to remain hidden for so long. Thus, investigators recorded. They were not dealing with a random episode, not a spontaneous outburst of aggression, but a systematic and cold-blooded behavior. And it was this that allowed the prosecution to build the accusation around the idea of intent and premeditation. The trial of Stanislav Kowalski became the culmination of many months of investigation. If in the initial stages all attention was focused on finding the truth and gathering evidence, now came the moment when all these materials were to be presented in the strict language of the law. This was where his fate was decided, and not only his. For relatives, it was a moment of truth. For the villagers, an opportunity to understand what had been happening literally before their eyes, and for investigators and the prosecution, a test of how thoroughly they had done their job. The official indictment was formulated with utmost clarity and detail. The prosecutor consistently listed all the articles that formed the basis of the case. The first, and perhaps most obvious, was unlawful deprivation of liberty. The investigative materials described in detail how, for 3 months, Agatha was in isolation, in conditions that deprived her of a normal existence. The second article was torture. Here, the focus was on the very nature of the confinement: lack of normal access to light, restriction of food and water, complete isolation from society. These actions were considered as systematic and prolonged influence, causing physical and psychological suffering. The third charge was leaving a person in danger. It was added because Stanislav, as a guardian, had a direct duty to care for her, but instead deliberately endangered her life. The prosecutor paid special attention to the qualifying feature, committed with particular cruelty. This was not just a formal detail. Legally, such an addition significantly increases the severity of the sentence. It emphasized that the crime was not a one-time act, but lasted for a long time, was deliberate and methodical. For the court, this was an important argument, showing that it was not an impulsive act, but action stretched over time and devoid of mercy. Naturally, the defense attempted to offer its version. Stanislav's lawyer insisted that the court was dealing with an elderly man who had distorted perceptions of reality. He argued that his client never intended real harm, that his actions were dictated by a conviction in the necessity of his own method of treatment. The defense claimed that Stanislav did not realize the full gravity of what was happening and acted more out of delusion than malicious intent. His age, loneliness, and limited social contacts were cited as arguments. But the prosecution quickly dismantled these arguments. The prosecutor reminded the court that the forensic psychiatric examination had found Stanislav to be fully sane. Experts emphasized he understood the nature and consequences of his actions, could distinguish right from wrong, and was aware of what he was doing. Moreover, the facts gathered during the investigation showed his consistency. He had prepared the place of isolation in advance, planned the system of food and water delivery, and regularly checked to ensure it remained unknown to outsiders. All this indicates that he acted consciously and systematically. The process lasted several sessions. The parties presented their evidence, experts were heard, interrogation protocols were read out, as were the testimonies of witnesses and Agatha herself. Every word, every detail came together to form a complete picture. The judge carefully noted all arguments, but the overall logic of the case became increasingly obvious. The defense's line could not withstand the confrontation with the facts. When the moment of verdict announcement arrived, there was a tense silence in the courtroom. The judge declared, "Stanislav Kowalski is found guilty on all counts." This conclusion was unambiguous and left no room for equivocal interpretations. Then, the sentence was pronounced. The court sentenced Stanislav to a real term of imprisonment. For an elderly man, this effectively meant that he would spend the rest of his life in confinement. For society, this sentence became a signal. Such actions cannot be justified by faith, delusions, or age. The conclusion of the process marked a kind of end to the most high-profile phase of this story. But simultaneously, it opened a new chapter. A discussion of how something like this could have gone on for so long in a small community where, it seemed, everyone knew their neighbor. The court put a legal end to it, but society was only just beginning to dissect the moral and social consequences of this tragedy. After the verdict was delivered, it might have seemed that a line was drawn in this story. But in reality, it was then that the most difficult and prolonged stage began. Life after the truth became public knowledge. And if for Stanislav his future was now mapped out in minute detail, years spent behind bars, for other participants in this tragedy, everything was just beginning. Each of them had to face devastating consequences that could not be undone or forgotten. First and foremost, attention was drawn to Agatha. Her condition after liberation turned out to be extremely severe: physical exhaustion, deep stress, anxiety, sleep disturbances. Doctors immediately decided on comprehensive rehabilitation. This was a whole journey, from medical recovery of the body to long-term consultations with psychologists. Specialists gradually restored her ability to trust others, learning with her to rebuild everyday life without fear. But the most important point was that she could not return to her parents. Child Protective Services decided to place her in a temporary foster family. There was control, security, and most importantly, specialists ready to monitor her condition around the clock. For Agatha herself, this meant a final break with her old home and familiar life. In her mind, this house ceased to be a symbol of family, transforming into a place she wanted to get away from as far as possible. But Agatha's fate is only one part of the picture. The parents who had been abroad all this time also came under close scrutiny. They claimed they were working in Germany to provide for the family and that they trusted Stanislav, who assured them over the phone that everything was fine. But the investigation perceived this differently. For the court, their inaction became a key point. After all, it was they who, by law, were supposed to ensure their daughter's safety. Based on the case materials, a separate process was initiated. It examined the issue of parental rights deprivation. Legally, this looked like a formality, but in essence, it was another blow to the family. The state could no longer trust them with the care of their own child. As for Stanislav himself, his future was no longer in doubt. The court found him guilty on all counts. He was to spend long years in a penal colony, and no appeals changed the essence of the sentence. From a village recluse, he transformed into a figure spoken of throughout the country. For his neighbors, his house became a symbol of a gruesome story, and he himself, an example of how superstitions and isolation can turn into a destructive force. His life, which had long lost touch with reality, was now ending in complete isolation. Only now by court order. Considering all this as a whole, the outcome seems not just tragic, but definitive. The Kowalski family as a single structure ceased to exist. The grandfather was imprisoned. The parents under threat of complete deprivation of rights and factual loss of their daughter. Agatha rescued, but with a heavy experience that will stay with her forever. Their story is an illustration of how the destructive consequences of a crime spread to all participants without exception. And these consequences extend much further than the 3 months of confinement themselves. It can be said that this is not just about a violation of the law. It is the collapse of a family, the disintegration of ties, the loss of trust and support. What was once called a cell of society was destroyed from within overnight. The house, which should have been a place of comfort and security, turned into a symbol of horror. The court decision only cemented what was obvious. There would be no return to the old life. This story showed crime is never limited to the moment it is committed. Its consequences live on for years, affecting people's fates, changing them completely. In the case of the Kowalski family, we see how one decision, made under the influence of superstitions and the desire for control, destroyed everything, both the family itself and notions of the future. This is not just a tragedy, but an example of how human life can be utterly distorted